Chapter 16. Skaggs's Theory. There was perhaps more depth to Mr. Skaggs than most people gave him credit for having. However it may be, when he got an idea into his head, whether it were insane or otherwise, he had a decidedly tenacious way of holding to it. Sadness had been disposed to laugh at him when he announced that Joe's drunken story of his father's troubles had given him an idea. But it was nevertheless true, and that idea had stayed with him clear through the exciting events that followed on that fatal night. He thought and dreamed of it until he had made a working theory. Then one day, with a boldness that he seldom assumed when in the sacred presence, he walked into the office and laid his plans before the editor. They talked together for some time, and the editor seemed hard to convince. "It would be a big thing for the paper," he said, "if it only panned out. But it is such a rattle-brained, harum-scarum thing. No one under the sun would have thought of it but you, Skaggs." "Oh, it's bound to pan out. I see the thing as clear as day. There's no getting around it." "Yes, it looks plausible, but so does all fiction. You're taking a chance. You're losing time. If it fails—" "But if it succeeds?" "Well, go and bring back a story. If you don't, look out. It's against my better judgment, anyway. Remember, I told you that." Skaggs shot out of the office, and within an hour and a half had boarded a fast train for the South. It is almost a question whether Skaggs had a theory or whether he had told himself a pretty story, and, as usual, believed it. The editor was right. No one else would have thought of the wild thing that was in the reporter's mind. The detective had not thought of it 5 years before, nor had Maurice Oakley and his friends had an inkling. And here was one of the New York Universe's young men, going miles to prove his idea about something that did not at all concern him. When Skaggs reached the town which had been the home of the Hamiltons, he went at once to the Continental Hotel. He had as yet formulated no plan for immediate action, and with a fool's or a genius's belief in his destiny, he sat down to await the turn of events. His first move would be to get acquainted with some of his neighbors. This was no difficult matter, as the bar at the Continental was still the gathering place of some of the city's choice spirits of the old regime. Thither he went, and his convivial cheerfulness soon placed him on terms of equality with many of his kind. He insinuated that he was looking around for business prospects. This proved his open sesame. 5 years had not changed the Continental frequenters much, and Skaggs's intention immediately brought Beachfield Davis down upon him with the remark, "If a man wants to go into business, business for a gentleman, sir. God, there's no finer or better paying business in the world than breeding blooded dogs, that is, if you get a man of experience to go in with you." "Dogs, dogs," drivelled old Horace Talbot. "Beachfield's always talking about dogs. I remember the night we were all discussing that Hamilton nigger's arrest. Beachfield said it was a sign of total depravity because his man hunted possums with his hound." The old man laughed inanely. The hotel whiskey was getting on his nerves. The reporter opened his eyes and his ears. He had stumbled upon something, at any rate. "What was it about some nigger's arrest, sir?" he asked respectfully. "Oh, it wasn't anything much. Only an old and trusted servant robbed his master, and my theory—" "But you will remember, Mr. Talbot," broke in Davis, "that I proved your theory to be wrong, and cited a conclusive instance." "Yes, a possum hunting dog." "I'm really anxious to hear about the robbery, though. It seems such an unusual thing for a Negro to steal a great amount." "Just so, and that was part of my theory. Now—" "It's an old story and a long one, Mr. Skaggs, and one of merely local repute," interjected Colonel Saunders. "I don't think it could possibly interest you. who are familiar with the records of the really great crimes that take place in a city such as New York. These things do interest me very much, though. I am something of a psychologist, and I often find the smallest and most insignificant appearing details pregnant with suggestion. Won't you let me hear the story, Colonel? Yes, though there's little in it, save that I am one of the few men who have come to believe that the Negro, Barry Hamilton, is not the guilty party. Nonsense, nonsense, said Talbot. Of course Barry was guilty, but, as I said before, I don't blame him. The Negroes— Total depravity, said Davis. Now look at my dog. If you will retire with me to the further table, I will give you whatever of the facts I can call to mind. As unobtrusively as they could, they drew apart from the others and seated themselves at a more secluded table, leaving Talbot and Davis wrangling as of old over their theories. When the glasses were filled and the pipes going, the Colonel began his story, interlarding it frequently with comments of his own. Now, in the first place, Mr. Skaggs, he said when the tale was done, I am lawyer enough to see for myself how weak the evidence was upon which the Negro was convicted, and later events have done much to confirm me in the opinion that he was innocent. Later events? Yes. The Colonel leaned across the table, and his voice fell to a whisper. 4 years ago, a great change took place in Maurice Oakley. It happened in the space of a day, and no one knows the cause of it. From a social, companionable man, he became a recluse, shunning visitors and dreading society. From an open-hearted, unsuspicious neighbor, he became secretive and distrustful of his own friends. From an active business man, he has become a retired brooder. He sees no one if he can help it. He writes no letters and receives none, not even from his brother, it is said. All of this came about in the space of 24 hours. But what was the beginning of it? No one knows, save that one day he had some sort of nervous attack. By the time the doctor was called he was better, but he kept clutching his hand over his heart. Naturally, the physician wanted to examine him there, but the very suggestion of it seemed to throw him into a frenzy, and his wife, too, begged the doctor, an old friend of the family, to desist. Maurice Oakley had been as sound as a dollar, and no one of the family had had any tendency to heart affection. It is strange. Strange it is, but I have my theory. His actions are like those of a man guarding a secret. Shh! His Negro laundress says that there is an inside pocket in his undershirts. An inside pocket? Yes. And for what? Skaggs was trembling with eagerness. The Colonel dropped his voice lower. We can only speculate, he said, but as I have said, I have my theory. Oakley was just a man, and in punishing his old servant for the supposed robbery, it is plain that he acted from principle. But he is also a proud man, and would hate to confess that he had been in the wrong. So I believed that the cause of his first shock was the finding of the money that he supposed gone. Unwilling to admit his error, he let his misapprehension go on, and it is the money which he carries in his secret pocket, with a morbid fear of its discovery, that has made him dismiss his servants, leave his business, and refuse to see his friends. A very natural conclusion, Colonel, and I must say that I believe you. It is strange that others have not seen as you have seen and brought the matter to light. Well, you see, Mr. Skaggs, none are so dull as the people who think they think. I can safely say that there is not another man in this town who has lighted upon the real solution of this matter, though it has been openly talked of for so long. But as for bringing it to light, no one would think of doing that. It would be sure to hurt Oakley's feelings, and he is one of our best families. Ah, yes, perfectly right. Skaggs had got all that he wanted, much more, in fact, than he had expected. The Colonel held him for a while yet to enlarge upon the views that he had expressed. When the reporter finally left him, it was with a cheery "Good night, Colonel. If I were a criminal, I should be afraid of that analytical mind of yours." He went upstairs chuckling. "The old fool!" he cried as he flung himself into a chair. "I've got it! I've got it! Maurice Oakley must see me. And then what?" He sat down to think out what he should do tomorrow. Again, with his fine disregard of ways and means, he determined to trust to luck, and, as he expressed it, brace old Oakley. Accordingly, he went about 9 o'clock the next morning to Oakley's house. A gray haired, sad eyed woman inquired his errand. "I want to see Mr. Oakley," he said. "You cannot see him. Mr. Oakley is not well and does not see visitors." "But I must see him, madam. I am here upon business of importance." "You can tell me just as well as him. I am his wife and transact all of his business." "I can tell no one but the master of the house himself." "You cannot see him. It is against his orders." "Very well," replied Skaggs, descending one step. "It is his loss, not mine. I have tried to do my duty and failed. Simply tell him that I came from Paris." "Paris?" cried a querulous voice behind the woman's back. "Leslie, why do you keep the gentleman at the door? Let him come in at once." Mrs. Oakley stepped from the door and Skaggs went in. Had he seen Oakley before, he would have been shocked at the change in his appearance. But as it was, the nervous, white haired man who stood shiftily before him told him nothing of an eating secret long carried. The man's face was gray and haggard, and deep lines were cut under his staring, fish-like eyes. His hair tumbled in white masses over his pallid forehead, and his lips twitched as he talked. "You're from Paris, sir? From Paris?" he said. "Come in, come in." His motions were nervous and erratic. Skaggs followed him into the library, and the wife disappeared in another direction. It would have been hard to recognize in the Oakley of the present the man of a few years before. The strong frame had gone away to bone, and nothing of his old power sat on either brow or chin. He was as a man who trembled on the brink of insanity. His guilty secret had been too much for him, and Skaggs's own fingers twitched as he saw his host's hands seek the breast of his jacket every other moment. "It is there that the secret is hidden," he said to himself, "and whatever it is, I must have it. But how? How? I can't knock the man down and rob him in his own house." But Oakley himself proceeded to give him the first clue. You perhaps have a message from my brother? My brother who is in Paris. I have not heard from him for some time." Skaggs's mind worked quickly. He remembered the Colonel's story. Evidently the brother had something to do with the secret. Now or never, he thought. So he said boldly, "Yes, I have a message from your brother." The man sprung up, clutching again at his breast. "You have? You have? Give it to me." "After 4 years he sends me a message. Give it to me." The reporter looked steadily at the man. He knew that he was in his power, that his very eagerness would prove traitor to his discretion. "Your brother bade me to say to you that you have a terrible secret, that you bear it in your breast. There, there. I am his messenger. He bids you to give it to me." Oakley had shrunken back as if he had been struck. "No, no," he gasped. "No, no, I have no secret." The reporter moved nearer him. The old man shrunk against the wall, his lips working convulsively, and his hand tearing at his breast as Skaggs drew nearer. He attempted to shriek, but his voice was husky and broke off in a gasping whisper. "Give it to me, as your brother commands." "No, no, no. It's not his secret, it's mine. I must carry it here always. Do you hear? I must carry it till I die. Go away, go away." Skaggs seized him. Oakley struggled weakly, but he had no strength. The reporter's hand sought the secret pocket. He felt a paper beneath his fingers. Oakley gasped hoarsely as he drew it forth, then, raising his voice, gave one agonized cry and sank to the floor, frothing at the mouth. At the cry, rapid footsteps were heard in the hallway, and Mrs. Oakley threw open the door. "What is the matter?" she cried. "My message has somewhat upset your husband," was the cool answer. "But his breast is open. Your hand has been in his bosom. You have taken something from him. Give it to me, or I shall call for help." Skaggs had not reckoned on this, but his wits came to the rescue. "You dare not call for help," he said, "or the world will know." She wrung her hands helplessly, crying, "Oh, give it to me, give it to me. We've never done you any harm." "But you've harmed someone else. That is enough." He moved toward the door, but she sprang in front of him with the fierceness of a tigress protecting her young. She attacked him with teeth and nails. She was pallid with fury, and it was all he could do to protect himself and yet not injure her. Finally, when her anger had taken her strength, he succeeded in getting out. He flew down the hallway and out of the front door, the woman's screams following him. He did not pause to read the precious letter until he was safe in his room at the Continental Hotel. Then he sprang to his feet, crying, thank God, I was right, and the universe shall have a sensation. The brother is the thief, and Berry Hamilton is an innocent man. Hurrah! Now who is it that has come on a wild goose chase? Who is it that ought to handle his idea carefully? Hi ho, Saunders, my man, the drinks'll be on you, and old Skaggsy will have done something good in the world. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of The Sport of the Gods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry DeGala in the mountains of Appalachia, Pennsylvania. The Sport of the Gods by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Chapter 17, A Yellow Journal. Mr. Skaggs had no qualms of conscience about the manner in which he had come by the damaging evidence against Maurice Oakley. It was enough for him that he had it. A corporation, he argued, had no soul, and therefore no conscience. How much less, then, should so small a part of a great corporation as himself be expected to have them? He had his story. It was vivid, interesting, dramatic. It meant the favor of his editor, a big thing for the universe, and a fatter lining for his own pocket. He sat down to put his discovery on paper before he attempted anything else, although the impulse to celebrate was very strong within him. He told his story well, with an eye to every one of its salient points. He sent an alleged picture of Berry Hamilton as he had appeared at the time of his arrest. He sent a picture of the Oakley home and of the cottage where the servant and his family had been so happy. There was a strong pen picture of the man, Oakley, grown haggard and morose from carrying his guilty secret, of his confusion when confronted with the supposed knowledge of it. The old southern city was described, and the opinions of its residents in regard to the case given. It was there, clear, interesting, and strong. One could see it all as if every phase of it were being enacted before one's eyes. Skaggs surpassed himself. When the editor first got hold of it, he said, "Huh!" over the opening lines. A few short sentences that instantly pricked the attention awake. He read on with increasing interest. "This is good stuff," he said at the last page. "Here's a chance for the universe to look into the methods of Southern court proceedings. Here's a chance for a spread." The universe had always claimed to be the friend of all poor and oppressed humanity, and every once in a while it did something to substantiate its claim, whereupon it stood off and said to the public, "Look you what we have done, and behold how great we are, the friend of the people." The universe was yellow. It was very so, but it had power and keenness and energy. It never lost an opportunity to crow, and if one was not forthcoming, it made one. In this way it managed to do a considerable amount of good, and its yellowness became forgivable, even commendable. In Skaggs' story, the editor saw an opportunity for one of its periodical philanthropies. He seized upon it. With headlines that took half a page, and with cuts authentic and otherwise, the tale was told, and the people of New York were greeted next morning with the announcement of "A burning shame! A poor and innocent Negro made to suffer for a rich man's crime. Great expose by the universe. A universe reporter to the rescue. The whole thing to be aired that the people may know." Then Skaggs received a telegram that made him leap for joy. He was to do it. He was to go to the capital of the state. He was to beard the governor in his den, and he, with the force of a great paper behind him, was to demand for the people the release of an innocent man. Then there would be another write-up and much glory for him, and more shekels. In an hour after he had received his telegram, he was on his way to the Southern capital. Meanwhile, in the house of Maurice Oakley, there were sad times. From the moment that the master of the house had fallen to the floor in impotent fear and madness, there had been no peace within his doors. At first his wife had tried to control him alone, and had humored the wild babblings with which he woke from his swoon. But these changed to shrieks and cries and curses, and she was forced to throw open the doors so long closed and call in help. The neighbors and her old friends went to her assistance, and what the reporter's story had not done, the ravings of the man accomplished. For with a show of matchless cunning, he continually clutched at his breast, laughed, and babbled his secret openly. Even then, they would have smothered it in silence for the honor of one of their best families. But too many ears had heard, and then came the yellow journal bearing all the news in emblazoned headlines. Colonel Saunders was distinctly hurt to think that his confidence had been imposed on, and that he had been instrumental in bringing shame upon a Southern name. "To think, sir," he said generally to the usual assembly of choice spirits, To think of that man's being a reporter, sir, a common ordinary reporter, and that I sat and talked to him as if he were a gentleman." "You are not to be blamed, Colonel," said old Horace Talbot. "You've done no more than any other gentleman would have done. The trouble that the average Northerner has no sense of honor, sir, no sense of honor. If this particular man had, he would have kept still, and everything would have gone on smooth and quiet. Instead of that, a distinguished family is brought to shame, and for what? To give a nigger a few more years of freedom, when likely as not he don't want it. And Barry Hamilton's life in prison has proved nearer the ideal reached by slavery than anything he has found since emancipation. Why, sirs, I fancy I see him leaving his prison with tears of regret in his eyes." Old Horace was inanely eloquent for an hour over his pet theory, but there were some in the town who thought differently about the matter, and it was their opinions and murmurings that backed up Skaggs and made it easier for him when at the Capitol he came into contact with the official red tape. He was told that there were certain forms of procedure and certain times for certain things, but he hammered persistently away. The murmurings behind him grew louder, while from his sanctum the editor of the Universe thundered away against oppression and high-handed tyranny. Other papers took it up and asked why this man should be despoiled of his liberty any longer. And when it was replied that the man had been convicted and that the wheels of justice could not be stopped or turned back by the letter of a romantic artist or the ravings of a madman, there was a mighty outcry against the farce of justice that had been played out in this man's case. The trial was reviewed, the evidence again brought up and examined. The dignity of the state was threatened. At this time, the state did the one thing necessary to save its tottering reputation. It would not surrender, but it capitulated. And Barry Hamilton was pardoned. Barry heard the news with surprise and a half-bitter joy. He had long ago lost hope that justice would ever be done to him. He marveled at the word that was brought to him now, and he could not understand the strange cordiality of the young white man who met him at the warden's office. 5 years of prison life had made a different man of him. He no longer looked to receive kindness from his fellows, and he blinked at it as he blinked at the unwanted brightness of the sun. The lines about his mouth, where the smiles used to gather, had changed and grown stern with the hopelessness of years. His lips drooped pathetically, and hard treatment had given his eyes a lowering look. His hair, that had hardly shown a white streak, was as white as Maurice Oakley's own. His erstwhile quick wits were dulled and embruted. He had lived like an ox, working without inspiration or reward, and he came forth like an ox from his stall. All the higher part of him he had left behind, dropping it off day after day through the wearisome years. He had put behind him the Barry Hamilton that laughed and joked and sang and believed. For even his faith had become only a numbed fancy. "This is a very happy occasion, Mr. Hamilton," said Skaggs, shaking his hand heartily. Barry did not answer. What had this slim, glib young man to do with him? What had any white man to do with him after what he had suffered at their hands? "You know you are to go New York with me." "To New York? What for?" Skaggs did not tell him that, now that the universe had done its work, it demanded the right to crow to its heart's satisfaction. He said only, "You want to see your wife, of course." Barry had forgotten Fanny, and for the first time his heart thrilled within him at the thought of seeing her again. "I hain't heard from my people for a long time. I didn't know what had become of 'em. How's Kit and Joe?" "They're all right," was the reply. Skaggs couldn't tell him, in this the first hour of his freedom. Let him have time to drink the sweetness of that all in. There would be time afterwards to taste all of the bitterness. Once in New York, he found that people wished to see him. Some fools, some philanthropists, and a great many reporters. He had to be photographed. All this before he could seek those whom he longed to see. They printed his picture as he was before he went to prison and as he was now, a sort of before and after taking comment. And in the morning that it all appeared, when the universe spread itself to tell the public what it had done and how it had done it, they gave him his wife's address. It would be better, they thought, for her to tell him herself all that happened. No one of them was brave enough to stand to look in his eyes when he asked for his son and daughter, and they shifted their responsibility by pretending to themselves that they were doing it for his own good, that the blow would fall more gently upon him from her, who had been his wife. Barry took the address and inquired his way timidly, hesitatingly, but with a swelling heart, to the door of the flat where Fanny lived. End of chapter 17. Recording by Larry DeGala in the mountains of Appalachia, Pennsylvania.
Chapter 18. What Barry Found. Had not Barry's years in prison life made him forget what little he knew of reading, he might have read the name Gibson on the doorplate where they told him to ring for his wife. But he knew nothing of what awaited him as he confidently pulled the bell. Fanny herself came to the door. The news the papers held had not escaped her, but she had suffered in silence, hoping that Barry might be spared the pain of finding her. Now he stood before her, and she knew him at a glance, in spite of his haggard countenance. "Fanny," he said, holding out his arms to her, and all of the pain and pathos of long yearning was in his voice, "don't you know me?" She shrank away from him, back into the hallway. "Yes, Barry, I knows you. Come in." She led him through the passageway and into her room, he following with a sudden sinking at his heart. This was not the reception he had expected from Fanny. When they were within the room he turned and held out his arms to her again, but she did not notice them. "Why, is you ashamed of me?" he asked brokenly. "Shamed? Oh, no, Berry." She sank into a chair and began rocking to and fro in her helpless grief. "What's de matter, Fanny? Ain't you glad to see me?" "Yes, yes, but you don't know nothin', do you? They left me to tell you." "Left you to tell me? What's the matter? Is Joe or Kit dead? Tell me." "No, not dead. Kit dances on the stage for a livin', and Berry, she ain't the gal she used to be. Joe, he's in the penitentiary for killin' a woman." Berry started forward with a cry. My God, my little girl, my boy!" "Dat ain't all," she went on dully, as if reciting a rote lesson. "I ain't your wife no more. I's is married agin. Oh, Berry, don't look at me like dat. I couldn't help it. Kit and Joe left me, and they said de penitentiary divorced you and me, and dat you'd never come out nohow. Don't look at me like dat, Berry." "You ain't my wife no more? It's a damn lie. You is my wife. I's an innocent man. No penitentiary can take you away from me. It's enough what they've done to my children." He rushed forward and seized her by the arm. "They shan't do no more, by God, they shan't, I say." His voice had risen to a fierce roar, like that of a hurt beast, and he shook her by the arm as he spoke. "Oh, don't, Berry, don't. You hurt me. I couldn't help it." He glared at her for a moment, and then the real force of the situation came full upon him. He bowed his head in his hands and wept like a child. The great sobs came up and stuck in his throat. She crept up to him fearfully and laid her hand on his head. "Don't cry, Berry," she said. "I done wrong, but I loves you yet." He seized her in his arms and held her tightly until he could control himself. Then he asked weakly, "Well, what am I going to do?" "I don't know, Berry, except that you have to leave me." "I won't. I'll never leave you again," he replied doggedly. "But you must. You'll only make it harder on me, and Gibson'll beat me again." "Again?" She hung her head. "Yes." He gripped himself hard. "Why can't you come off with me, Fanny? You was mine first." "I couldn't. He'd find me anywhere I went to." "Let him find you. You'd be with me, and we'll settle it, him and me." "I want to, but oh, I can't," she wailed. "Please go now, Berry, before he gets home. He's mad anyhow, 'cause you're out." Berry looked at her hard, and then said in a dry voice, "And so I got to leave you to him?" "Yes, you must. I'm his'n now." He turned to the door, murmuring, "My wife gone, Kit a nobody, and Joe, little Joe, a murderer. And then I used to pray to God and call him our Father." He laughed hoarsely. It sounded like nothing Fanny had ever heard before. "Don't, Berry, don't say that. Maybe we don't understand." Her faith still hung by a slender thread, but his had given way in that moment. "No, we don't understand," he laughed as he went out of the door. "We don't understand." He staggered down the steps, blinded by his emotions, and set his face towards the little lodging that he had taken temporarily. There seemed nothing left in life for him to do, yet he knew that he must work to live, although the effort seemed hardly worth while. He remembered now that the universe had offered him the under janitorship in its building. He would go and take it, and some day perhaps— He was not quite sure what the perhaps meant, but as his mind grew clearer he came to know, for a sullen, fierce anger was smoldering in his heart against the man who through lies had stolen his wife from him. It was anger that came slowly, but gained in fierceness as it grew. Yes, that was it. He would kill Gibson. It was no worse than his present state. Then it would be father and son murderers. They would hang him or send him back to prison. Neither would be hard now. He laughed to himself. And this was what they had let him out of prison for? To find out all this? Why had they not left him there to die in ignorance? What had he to do with all these people who gave him sympathy? What did he want of their sympathy? Could they give him back one tithe of what he had lost? Could they restore him his wife or his son or his daughter, his quiet happiness or his simple faith? He went to work for the universe, but night after night, armed, he patrolled the sidewalk in front of Fanny's house. He did not know Gibson, but he wanted to see them together. Then he would strike. His vigils kept him from his bed, but he went to the next morning's work with no weariness. The hope of revenge sustained him, and he took a savage joy in the thought that he should be the dispenser of justice to at least one of those who had wounded him. Finally he grew impatient and determined to wait no longer, but to seek his enemy in his own house. He approached the place cautiously and went up the steps. His hand touched the bell pull. He staggered back. "Oh, my God," he said. There was crape on Fanny's bell. His head went round and he held to the door for support. Then he turned the knob and the door opened. He went noiselessly in. At the door of Fanny's room he halted, sick with fear. He knocked. A step sounded within, and his wife's face looked out upon him. He could have screamed aloud with relief. "It ain't you," he whispered huskily. "No, it's him. He was killed in a fight at the racetrack. Some of his friends are setting up. Come in." He went in, a wild, strange feeling surging at his heart. She showed him into the death chamber. As he stood and looked down upon the face of his enemy, still, cold, and terrible in death, the recognition of how near he had come to crime swept over him, and all his dead faith sprang into new life in a glorious resurrection. He stood with clasped hands, and no words passed his lips, but his heart was crying, thank God, this man's blood is not on my hands." The gamblers who were sitting up with the dead wondered who the old fool was who looked at their silent comrade and then raised his eyes as if in prayer. When Gibson was laid away, there were no formalities between Berry and his wife. They simply went back to each other. New York held nothing for them now but sad memories. Kit was on the road, and the father could not bear to see his son, so they turned their faces southward, back to the only place they could call home. Surely the people could not be cruel to them now, and even if they were, they felt that after what they had endured, no wound had power to give them pain. Leslie Oakley heard of their coming, and with her own hands reopened and refurnished the little cottage in the yard for them. There the white-haired woman begged them to spend the rest of their days and be in peace and comfort. It was the only amend she could make, and much to satisfy her as to settle themselves, they took the cottage. And many a night thereafter they sat together with clasped hands, listening to the shrieks of the madman across the yard, and thinking of what he had brought to them and to himself. It was not a happy life, but it was all that was left to them, and they took it without complaint, for they knew they were powerless against some will infinitely stronger than their own. End of chapter 18. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of The Sport of the Gods by Paul Laurence Dunbar.